Picture this. You are standing on the promenade deck of a ship, but not just any ship.
Right.
You are aboard a literal floating palace of art and luxury, just slicing through the freezing pitch-black waters of the North Atlantic.
And it is completely dark out there.
Pitch black. It's the dead of night, July 25, 1956. You are just south of Nantucket, and the air around you gets suddenly thick.
Like incredibly heavy.
Yeah, a dense, suffocating fog bank has just rolled in off the coast. It is so heavy it feels like a damp wool blanket pressed against your face.
Oh, wow.
You literally can't see the ocean. You can barely even see the mahogany railing inches from your hands. You are speeding blindly through this completely impenetrable gray wall.
And the crazy thing is, you feel perfectly safe.
Exactly. You've been told this ship is an absolute marvel of modern engineering, boasting safety technology so advanced it is practically invincible.
But that false sense of security is the most terrifying part. I mean, you are surrounded by absolute isolation, right? The deafening silence of the fog.
Just the fog and the hum of the engines.
Yeah, the rhythmic, pulsing hum of those massive engines deep below your feet, pushing you forward at highway speeds.
Which is insane in zero visibility.
Totally insane. And what you don't know and what you cannot possibly see is that lurking inside this exact same fog bank, another ship is hurtling directly toward you.
Unseen. Just a ghost in the fog.
Right. And this other vessel, it isn't a luxury liner. It is essentially a floating battering ram.
A battering ram.
Heavily reinforced with steel, built for the singular purpose of smashing through solid ice.
Wow. Welcome to this deep dive into the source material, everyone. We are stepping into a real-life maritime horror story today.
We really are.
We are going to reconstruct the agonizing, terrifying death of this supposedly unsinkable luxury liner, the SS Andrea Doria.
A ship that really shouldn't have gone down.
Right, and we're going to explore the catastrophic hubris that put her in danger, the suffocating claustrophobic terror of her final hours in the dark, and the deadly curse that actually still haunts her collapsing wreckage today.
It is a dark, dark story.
We have a mountain of sources detailing how the absolute pinnacle of human luxury was undone by this toxic mix of bad weather, arrogance, and human error.
And what we are also going to dissect is this deeply unsettling paradox. The Andrea Doria was basically destroyed by the very technology that was meant to save it.
Yeah, it's so incredibly ironic.
It is. This isn't just a story of two ships bumping in the night. It is a forensic breakdown of what happens when human arrogance meets the unforgiving power of the ocean.
And how the illusion of total safety can just shatter in a fraction of a second.
Absolutely.
So I want you to place yourself on those tilting decks in the dead of night. As we reconstruct this nightmare, ask yourself, what would you do when the solid steel floor beneath your feet suddenly becomes a sheer, oil-slick drop into the freezing abyss?
God, just thinking about it is terrifying.
It really is. Now, to really understand the sheer scale of the tragedy that unfolded that night, we first have to understand the staggering psychological and cultural weight of the Andrea Doria.
Right, because this was not a standard commuter vessel.
No, not at all. This ship represented the literal resurrection of an entire nation.
Context is everything here. Following World War II, Italy's economy and national pride were just in ruins.
Oh, completely devastated.
Yeah, they had lost half of their merchant fleet to Allied bombings and post-war reparations.
And their former pride and joy, right? The wrecks?
The legendary ocean liner, the Rex, exactly. It had been bombed by the Royal Air Force and sunk. So the Italian line, backed by the government, they needed to make a statement to the world.
They needed a win.
They needed a symbol of rebirth, yeah. A floating embassy to prove that Italy had recovered its mastery of art, culture, and engineering.
So the Italian line commissions the Andrea Doria and essentially just hands a blank check to their designer.
A totally blank check.
They poured over $1 million. And keep in mind, this is 1950s money we are talking about here.
It's a massive fortune.
Just a staggering amount of money poured just into the artwork and interior decor alone.
Yeah, designed by the visionary architect Giulio Minnelletti.
Minnelletti, right. And the ship was a behemoth, nearly 700 feet long, displacing over 29,100 tons of water. She was built to hold over 1,200 passengers in absolute staggering opulence.
Minnelletti really envisioned a floating art gallery, and I mean, he achieved exactly that.
The details are incredible.
The ship housed bespoke surrealist murals by Italian masters, intricate tapestries, custom ceramics.
They even had 3 separate outdoor swimming pools.
Yeah, each featuring its own terraced veranda, strictly divided by passenger class, of course.
Of course. And the centerpiece of the first-class lounge was this massive, life-size bronze statue of the 16th century Genoese admiral she was named after.
Andrea Doria himself.
Right. They spared absolutely no expense on the aesthetics,
Yeah.
and they were equally aggressive in marketing her safety features.
They really leaned into the safety angle.
Oh, heavily. The brochures touted her as the safest ship on the ocean. The Italian line promoted the fact that she was equipped with a double hull.
Which is a big selling point.
Yeah, because a double hull sounds incredibly reassuring to a passenger. It sounds like you're wearing a suit of armor beneath your suit of armor.
The mechanical concept of a double hull is pretty straightforward in theory. You build an inner, watertight skin and an outer skin separated by a gap.
How big of a gap?
In this case, about 3 feet. The idea is that if the ship scrapes a reef or collides with a submerged object, the outer hull is breached, but the inner hull remains intact.
Keeping the ocean out of the ship's vital internal spaces.
Exactly.
They also heavily promoted her radar capabilities. In the early 1950s, early warning radar was still relatively novel for commercial passenger liners.
It was cutting-edge technology.
Having dual radar arrays sweeping the horizon made the crew feel like they had godlike vision through any weather condition.
Which we'll see was a fatal assumption.
Right. But the ultimate guarantee of safety, the feature that gave them the confidence to throw around the word unsinkable, was the system of watertight compartments.
Yes, the internal architecture of the lower decks was divided by 11 massive steel bulkheads.
And a bulkhead is basically just a solid steel wall, right?
Exactly, running horizontally across the width of the ship, separating the hull into distinct zones. The engineers proudly claimed that any 2 of these 11 compartments could be completely flooded with seawater, and the ship would maintain enough buoyancy to stay afloat.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because whenever someone uses the word unsinkable in maritime history, it usually ends with a massive loss of life.
Is practically a cursed word.
Seriously.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the blueprints provided in our sources, and the physics of this design just seem completely flawed from the start.
They were heavily compromised.
Yeah, you have a ship loaded with heavy bronze statues, multiple swimming pools holding tons of water high up on the top decks, and an incredibly narrow hull meant for speed.
It's a recipe for disaster.
This isn't a stable platform. It looks like a beautiful but dangerously top-heavy sports car. It might look stunning in the showroom, but the moment you take a sharp corner at high speed, it's going to roll right over.
Your deduction hits on the exact fatal flaw that doomed the ship. And the terrifying part is that the engineers knew about it before she ever touched the water.
Wait, they knew it was unstable.
Oh, absolutely. During the initial design phase, they ran extensive model testing in scaled wave tanks.
And what did the data say?
The physics data actively predicted that the Andrea Doria possessed a dangerously high center of gravity. The model showed she would develop a severe list, a dangerous sideways tilt, if she was subjected to any significant asymmetric force.
That is wild. And they didn't even have to wait for a collision to see this nightmare scenario play out in reality.
No, they didn't.
Because on her maiden voyage in January 1953, she hit a severe North Atlantic squall on her approach to New York. A single, massive rogue wave struck the broadside of the ship.
And the result was terrifying.
The impact caused the Andrea Doria to list a staggering 28 degrees.
Let the physics of a 28-degree list sink in for a moment.
It's hard to even picture.
If you are standing in a grand dining room, the floor suddenly drops away at a sharp angle. Tables, chairs, grand pianos, passengers' gravity turns everything into a lethal projectile sliding toward the wall.
Just total chaos.
The ship hung at that terrifying angle, struggling to right herself, exposing just how fragile her balance truly was.
And reading through the engineering reports, this inherent top heaviness was severely aggravated at the worst possible time, which is the end of a voyage.
Because of the fuel.
Right. The Doria was a steamship that burned massive amounts of heavy fuel oil. That oil was stored in huge tanks deep in the bottom of the hull, acting as a stabilizing weight.
Like a keel weight.
Exactly.
There.
But as she crossed the Atlantic, she burned through thousands of tons of that fuel. By the time she approached New York, those bottom tanks were mostly empty.
The weight that was anchoring her center of gravity deep in the water was just gone, making her even more top-heavy, just as she entered the crowded, notoriously foggy shipping lanes of the American Eastern Seaboard.
That's a disaster waiting to happen.
But the true sinister danger of this instability lay in how it interacted with those vaunted watertight bulkheads.
The 11 steel walls.
Right. Those steel walls meant to contain flooded water. They didn't go all the way up to the main deck. They stopped at A deck.
Wait, I need to make sure I understand the mechanics of this. Are you saying the watertight walls just ended halfway up the inside of the ship?
That is precisely the structural reality. The bulkheads were capped at A deck to allow for long, uninterrupted passenger corridors on the decks above.
Wow. Form over function.
Totally. The mathematical model showed that as long as the ship stayed relatively upright, the water would fill a compartment up to sea level and stop, contained by the bulkheads on either side.
But we just established she doesn't stay upright. She lists heavily.
Exactly.
If a compartment floods and the ship leans over past 20 degrees, what happens at the top of that bulkhead on A deck?
The top of the bulkhead dips below the waterline. The ocean simply spills over the top of the steel wall and floods down into the adjacent, supposedly dry compartment.
It's exactly like an ice cube tray.
Yes.
If you fill one slot in an ice cube tray with water, it stays contained. But the second you tilt the tray, the water just cascades over the little plastic divider and fills the next slot and the next until the whole thing is flooded.
The ice cube tray analogy perfectly illustrates the mechanical failure. The compartments were only watertight if the Andrea Doria remained perfectly level.
Which is impossible in a disaster.
Right. If she took on water and leaned too far, the entire multi-million-dollar safety system was instantly rendered utterly useless. The ship would tear her own internal defenses apart just by tilting.
She was a ticking time bomb, a masterpiece of art and luxury, masking a fundamentally unstable, deeply flawed hull.
And on the night of July 25, 1956, the trigger for that bomb was steaming out of New York Harbor, heading straight for her.
Yes, the trigger was the MS Stockholm, a ship that represented a totally different philosophy of maritime engineering.
The complete opposite of the Doria.
The Stockholm is the absolute antithesis of the Andrea Doria. She belonged to the Swedish-American line, and her design reflects a totally different set of priorities.
She was significantly smaller, right?
Much smaller, about 525 feet long, and displacing 12,165 tons. You won't find any surrealist murals or terrace verandas here.
No bronze statues.
None. The Stockholm is stark, practical, and highly utilitarian.
The Swedish builders in the late 1940s completely misread the post-war travel market. They assumed the advent of commercial air travel would instantly kill the transatlantic ocean liner industry.
So they built it on a budget.
Exactly. They built the Stockholm to be economical. They wanted a ship that was cheap to run, easy to maintain, and functional.
But what is truly chilling about the Stockholm, particularly in the context of this disaster, is the architecture of her bow.
The Stockholm wasn't just built to cross the Atlantic.
No, she was built to survive the freezing, treacherous, ice-choked waters of the Baltic Sea in the dead of winter.
Which requires a very specific design.
Right. Standard ship bows are designed to slice through liquid water. If a standard bow hits solid ice, the steel plates crumple inward, rupturing the hull. To survive in the Baltic, the Stockholm was constructed with an ice-breaking bow.
The metallurgical demands of an ice-breaking bow are extreme. The prow of the Stockholm was heavily reinforced with thick, overlapping plates of hardened steel.
Like armor.
Basically, yeah, backed by a dense network of internal steel framing. Furthermore, the shape of the bow is different. It is raked, meaning it angles forward sharply.
Why is that important?
So that when the ship strikes an ice floe, the bow rides up onto the ice, and the sheer weight of the ship crushes downward, shattering the obstacle.
That is terrifying. She wasn't just a passenger ship. Structurally speaking, the Stockholm was a massive, floating anvil.
A heavily armored battering ram.
And on this eerie, fateful night, these two totally different ships, built for entirely different purposes, are hurtling toward each other. The Andrea Doria is heading west toward New York. The Stockholm is heading east toward Sweden.
And the environment that night created the perfect storm for a catastrophe.
The fog.
The Andrea Doria, moving westward, was completely swallowed by a massive, zero-visibility fog bank.
While the Stockholm is in the clear.
Right. Moving eastward, the Stockholm was sailing under clear, starlit skies, completely unaware that a wall of fog lay just ahead of them.
This is where human arrogance begins to drastically compound the environmental danger. There was a well-established safety protocol called the 1953 North Atlantic Track Agreement.
A crucial safety measure.
Yeah, it dictated specific, separated lanes for eastbound and westbound ships, functioning exactly like a divided highway to prevent head-on collisions.
But the Stockholm's captain, Harry Gunnar Nordenson, made a calculated, highly reckless decision.
To save time, right?
To shave time off his voyage and save fuel, yeah. He set a course nearly 20 miles north of the recommended eastbound route.
20 miles?
He essentially pulled his ship out of the safe eastbound lane and drove it directly into the oncoming westbound traffic lane.
Driving the wrong way down an invisible highway in the dark.
Exactly.
And meanwhile, on the Andrea Doria, Captain Piero Calamai, who is a highly respected, seasoned veteran of 2 world wars, by the way, he is plunging headlong through this blinding fog.
Which violates basic maritime rules.
Completely. The fundamental rules of navigation state that in restricted visibility, a vessel must reduce speed to a point where it can stop within half the distance of its visible line of sight.
In a fog bank this dense, where visibility is reduced to mere feet, adhering to that rule means the ship should be practically crawling.
Barely moving at all.
Moving just fast enough to maintain steering control.
But Calamai doesn't do that. He barely touches the throttle. He drops his speed from 23 knots to 21.8 knots.
It's a fractional, almost meaningless reduction.
He is still tearing through the pitch black at nearly 25 miles per hour. He is desperate to maintain his morning arrival schedule in New York, prioritizing the Italian line's reputation for punctuality over basic maritime safety.
The physics of the situation are terrifying. We have 2 massive steel vessels speeding toward each other at a combined closing speed of roughly 40 knots.
That is almost 46 miles per hour.
And neither bridge crew has visual contact with the other. They are entirely reliant on the glowing green sweeps of their radar screens.
I need to pause here because the psychological element of this is fascinating. We've all experienced something like this on a tiny scale.
The hallway dance.
Yes. Imagine walking down a dark hallway. You see a shadowy figure ahead of you, so you step to your left to avoid them.
But the other person stepping toward you steps to their right, which is your left, and you bump right into each other.
Exactly. Only in this scenario, the people are tens of thousands of tons of steel moving at highway speeds. How could 2 highly trained professional crews equipped with state-of-the-art radar be so completely blind to what was happening?
What's fascinating here is the mechanism of their failure. It's a textbook example of a phenomenon known as a radar-assisted collision.
A radar-assisted collision? That sounds so bleak.
It is a tragic technological paradox where the very instrument meant to save your life provides a false reality that ultimately kills you. In 1956, radar was not the digitized, highly automated system we have today.
No GPS maps.
Right. It was a cathode ray tube screen in a dark room requiring intense human interpretation.
So, on the bridge of the Stockholm, the 3rd officer, Johan Ernst Carstens Johansson, was alone. He was exhausted, having been awake since 6:00 a.m., supervising the heavy physical labor of baggage loading before departure.
He's running on fumes.
Totally. And he is staring into a hooded radar scope trying to decipher the glowing blips.
Naval engineers and maritime lawyers who later forensically studied the disaster identified a terrifyingly simple, fatal mechanical mistake.
What was it?
The radar set on the Stockholm featured a dial that changed the scale of the screen. You could set it to view objects within a 5-mile radius or a 15-mile radius.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, the radar interface did not have a clear illuminated indicator light explicitly stating which scale was currently active.
Oh no, let me guess. Carstens looked at the screen and thought he was looking at a massive 15-mile chunk of the ocean.
He was absolutely convinced the radar was set to the 15-mile scale. In reality, the dial was set to the 5-mile scale.
That is a catastrophic cognitive error. When he saw the glowing dot of the Andrea Doria on his screen, he mentally calculated that she was 3 times further away than she actually was.
He thought he had miles of ocean and plenty of time to maneuver.
In reality, the behemoth was right on top of him.
The misinterpretations compounded rapidly. Because the Stockholm was sailing in clear weather and was just arriving at the edge of the fog bank, Carstens did not realize the oncoming ship was completely blinded.
Because he couldn't see the fog from the radar.
Right. He looked at the tiny blip on his screen and assumed it was a small, blacked-out fishing vessel or perhaps a military ship running darkened maneuvers.
It never crossed his mind that he was looking at a massive, top-heavy luxury liner screaming through zero-visibility fog at 22 knots.
And here's the truly insane part of the 1950s maritime culture. They never picked up the radio.
Really?
They never called each other to say, hey, I see you on radar, I'm going to turn left. Radio contact wasn't strictly mandated back then.
That is mind-blowing.
They were just silently guessing each other's intentions based on these little green dots slowly crawling across the screen.
And their silent guesses were fatally opposed. The standard maritime rule for a head-on encounter, the rule of the road for the ocean, is for both ships to turn to starboard, which is their right side.
Right, to pass port to port.
Exactly. This ensures the ships pass port to port, meaning their left sides slide past one another. Believing he has plenty of room, Carstens on the Stockholm eventually orders a turn to starboard to widen the passing gap.
But over on the Andrea Doria, Captain Calamai is staring at his own radar. He misinterprets the Stockholm's speed and trajectory.
So what does he do?
Instead of following the standard rule and turning right, Calamai makes a highly unusual decision. He orders his helmsman to turn to port to his left, attempting a starboard to starboard pass.
Oh my God. The geometry of their decisions just doomed them. Carstens turned right. Calamai turned left.
By turning in the same absolute geographical direction, their evasive maneuvers perfectly canceled each other out.
Instead of opening the distance between them, they were actively closing the circle. They built a geographic trap and locked themselves into a fatal embrace.
The timeline closes in. It is 11:10 p.m. The fog enveloping the Andrea Doria is a solid, impenetrable gray wall.
On the bridge, Captain Calamai is gripping the railing, peering desperately into the darkness.
And then the fog parts. Just for a fraction of a second, the mist swirls away.
And what Calamai sees is pure nightmare fuel.
Emerging from the mist, bearing down directly on his starboard side, are the glowing masthead lights of the Stockholm.
Calamai screams for a hard left turn, a desperate, final attempt to outrun the bow, to drag the massive tail of his luxury liner out of the path of the battering ram.
But the laws of physics are unforgiving.
There is too much mass and too much forward momentum. A 29,000-ton ship cannot turn on a dime.
Simultaneously, on the Stockholm, Carstens looks out his window and sees a mountain of steel suddenly materialize out of the fog.
Just a wall of metal.
The massive, brilliantly illuminated broadside of the Andrea Doria fills his entire field of vision. He screams for the engines to go full astern, trying to throw the ship into reverse.
But it is mechanically impossible to halt 12,000 tons of forward momentum in a matter of seconds.
The impact is visceral and catastrophic. The Stockholm's specially designed ice-breaking bow, that hardened steel anvil built to crush glaciers, slams directly into the starboard side of the Andrea Doria at nearly a 90-degree angle.
It doesn't just bumper or scrape the paint.
No.
The battering ram penetrates almost 40 feet deep into the Italian liner's hull, ripping completely through the protective double hull as if it were tinfoil, and crushing the ship's vital keel.
The physical devastation inflicted in that specific microsecond is almost beyond human comprehension. The Stockholm's bow sliced violently through 5 distinct passenger decks.
The acoustic violence of that moment must have been mind-shattering. Imagine the sound of thousands of tons of structural steel ripping, tearing, and shredding through bulkheads.
Severing massive electrical cables.
Snapping high-pressure plumbing lines, and utterly annihilating human living quarters.
The survivors later described the noise as a deafening explosion, like a massive firecracker going off inside their heads, followed immediately by the unending shrieking agony of twisting metal.
And the human toll inside that 40-foot impact zone was absolute carnage. The historical sources give us these details that are just haunting.
They are incredibly grim.
You have Colonel Walter Carlin. He is traveling in first-class cabin 46. At 11:10 p.m., he is standing in his bathroom brushing his teeth.
Just a normal night.
The collision throws him violently against the wall, but he survives the shockwave. He dusts himself off, walks out of his bathroom, and stops dead.
Because the room is gone.
The entire exterior wall of his luxury cabin is simply gone, sheared clean off by the Swedish bow. And his wife, Jeanette, who had been reading comfortably in bed just seconds prior, she is gone.
It's just unthinkable.
The bed, the floor, the wall vanished into the black churning sea.
The randomness of survival in the impact zone is chilling. Just a few cabins down, in the direct line of the Stockholm's relentless prow, is Camille Cianfora, a highly respected foreign correspondent for the New York Times.
Right.
He is subjected to massive blunt force trauma and is killed moments after the collision. His 8-year-old daughter, Joan, is crushed in the mangled steel and killed instantly.
But then, in the very midst of this horrific slaughter, you have a story that fundamentally defies the laws of physics. 14-year-old Linda Morgan, who is Jane Cianfora's daughter from a previous marriage to the radio broadcaster Edward P. Morgan.
She was sound asleep in her bed on the Andrea Doria.
And the press would later dub her the Miracle Girl.
Yes. The Stockholm's crushed bow smashes directly into Linda's cabin, utterly obliterating the room. But somehow, in the chaotic, mangled physics of the collision, the steel plating of the Stockholm sweeps directly under her mattress.
The momentum acts like a giant violent spatula.
Exactly. She is literally scooped out of the sinking Andrea Doria, launched through the air, and deposited safely onto the crushed, tangled deck of the Stockholm.
Without waking up.
She wakes up, deeply confused, shivering in the cold night air with a broken arm, looking up at the open sky on the very ship that just destroyed her own.
It is a mechanical impossibility that somehow happened. A Spanish-speaking sailor on the Stockholm is searching through the wrecked steel of his own ship's bow and finds this teenage girl in pajamas.
And she looks at him and says, "I was on the Andrea Doria. Where am I now?"
It perfectly encapsulates the bizarre, unpredictable violence of the impact.
It really does. But while the human tragedy in the crushed cabins is horrific, the ship itself has just suffered a catastrophic, utterly fatal mechanical trauma.
The battering ram has done exactly what it was designed to do.
And the Andrea Doria's fatal design flaws are about to be weaponized against her passengers. We discussed the ship's danger center of gravity and the empty fuel tanks earlier. Now watch how those factors align to destroy the vessel. The Stockholm's bow didn't just hit passenger cabins. It ripped open 5 massive deep-sea fuel tanks on the Andrea Doria's starboard side.
Oh, no.
In an instant, thousands of tons of freezing, heavy seawater violently rushed into those empty steel caverns.
I want to focus on this because the maritime engineering failure here is staggering. When a steamship burns off its heavy oil during a voyage, it is standard operating procedure to pump seawater back into those empty tanks.
Yes, it's called ballasting.
It's like a scuba diver wearing a weight belt.
Yeah.
If you take the weights off the right side of your belt, the buoyancy of your body is going to force you to roll violently to the left the second you hit the water.
Exactly.
The Italian line explicitly chose not to ballast the Doria's empty tanks with seawater because cleaning the salty residue out of the tanks later was expensive and time-consuming.
They chose operational cost-cutting over structural stability.
And that cost-cutting measure doomed the ship. The starboard tanks were suddenly filled with thousands of tons of dead ocean weight, dragging the right side of the ship down.
Conversely, the corresponding fuel tanks on the port side, the left side of the ship, were completely empty.
Filled only with highly buoyant air.
Right, pushing the left side up. The imbalance was immediate, violent, and unstoppable. Within mere minutes of the impact, the Andrea Doria was listing 20 degrees to starboard.
20 degrees. Bring back the ice cube tray analogy. At 20 degrees, the entire watertight safety system fails.
Exactly. The tops of those shortened bulkheads on A deck were physically pulled below the ocean's surface level relative to the ship.
So the water just flows right over.
The sea began spilling over the tops of the steel walls, cascading down the stairwells, flooding down the passenger corridors, filling one supposedly watertight compartment after another in a relentless cascading failure.
And the collision also ruptured an access tunnel, didn't it?
Yes, leading directly from the main generator room. And in a lethal, inexplicable oversight of marine engineering, the designers had failed to install a watertight door where that tunnel passed through the bulkhead.
The ocean just surged, unimpeded, right down that tunnel and smashed into the generator room. And when the massive electrical generators of a 1950s ocean liner flood with seawater,
the power grid instantly shorts out and dies.
the massive ship goes completely dark. You are plunging hundreds of terrified, disoriented people into absolute pitch-black darkness, trapped inside a labyrinth of tilted, groaning steel.
Welcome to the sloping deck of dread.
The claustrophobia of those lower decks must have been suffocating. The passengers trapped down there, especially on C deck, which was heavily populated by Italian immigrant families who had saved everything they had to seek a new life in America, awoke to a living nightmare.
It's heartbreaking.
They were plunged into darkness, choking on thick black smoke from electrical fires, sparked by the short-circuiting cables, surrounded by the sounds of screaming, and feeling the freezing, oily water rapidly rising around their ankles.
We have to remember that this wasn't the opulent first-class area with the bronze statues and the verandas. This was the crowded, labyrinthine tourist class deep in the bowels of the ship.
Right.
The sources detail the agonizing fate of the Sergio family. Maria Sergio and her 4 young children, Giuseppe, Anna Maria, Domenica, and 4-year-old Rocco.
Oh, man.
They were booked in a cabin on the starboard side, directly in the path of the collision. They were crushed instantly in their sleep.
And the husband?
Maria's husband was waiting for them on a train platform in Indiana, totally unaware his entire family had just been erased.
The structural trap claimed so many. There was the Barada family. Agnes Barada, a gifted opera singer on her way to audition for the San Francisco Opera, killed instantly along with her mother.
And Angelina, Diana and her two youngest children, 8-year-old Biagio and 6-year-old Victoria, lost somewhere in the mangled, flooded steel corridors of sea deck.
For the survivors trying to escape from those lower decks, the physical environment was torturous. Try to mentally place yourself in a long, narrow ship corridor. But the floor beneath you is tilted at a severe 20-degree angle.
Right, the wall is essentially becoming the floor.
Every surface is slick with freezing seawater and highly toxic, incredibly slippery black bunker fuel oil that has violently ruptured from the deep tanks.
There is no lighting except for a few dim, battery-powered emergency red bulbs cutting through the smoke.
People are scrambling, slipping, crawling over one another, trying to drag themselves up grand staircases that are now slanted at bizarre, vertigo-inducing angles.
And as they finally claw their way up through the dark, dragging their injured loved ones to the open boat deck, desperate for the cool night air and salvation, they are met with the cruelest, most terrifying irony of the Andrea Doria's state-of-the-art safety features.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The lifeboats. This is a brilliant example of how perfectly good engineering fails completely when the foundation shifts. The Andrea Doria was thoroughly equipped. She had 16 massive steel lifeboats, more than enough capacity for every single passenger and crew member on board.
But remember that severe 20-degree list.
The ship is leaning heavily to the right.
That geometric reality completely breaks the lifeboat deployment system.
How so?
Lifeboats are deployed using large, crane-like structures called davits. These davits rely entirely on gravity to swing the boat out over the edge of the ship and lower it to the water.
Makes sense.
The mechanism was engineered to function with a maximum list of 15 degrees. Beyond that angle, the physics turn against you.
And they were at 20 degrees.
Right. The 8 lifeboats on the port side, the high side of the leaning ship, are now angled inward, pointing up toward the open deck.
Wait, so if they try to lower them?
If the crew released the winches to lower those portside boats, gravity wouldn't pull them out over the ocean. It would pull them inward, scraping and smashing them violently against the exposed steel plates of the ship's own hull.
Wow. They were completely pinned against the side of the ship by gravity. In an instant, half of the Andrea Doria's lifeboats were utterly useless.
And the situation on the starboard side, the side leaning down toward the black water, presented a different kind of nightmare.
Because it's leaning so far over.
Because the ship was leaning so far outward. When the crew swung the starboard davits out, gravity pulled the lifeboats far away from the side of the hull. They hung out in empty space.
So they couldn't just step into them.
No, they couldn't be pulled tight against the promenade deck windows for passengers to simply step into them, as the designers intended.
So the crew is forced to lower these heavy steel lifeboats completely empty into the black rolling waves below. And then the passengers, who are already traumatized, freezing, coated in toxic oil and standing in the pitch black, have to figure out how to bridge the gap between the ship and the boats.
It created an environment of utter desperation and chaotic panic. To reach the edge of the ship, passengers had to literally sit down and slide across the heavily tilted, oil-slicked wooden decks.
Praying they didn't slide too fast and shoot under the railing into the ocean.
Exactly. Once at the edge, they had to tie themselves to heavy mooring ropes or climb down flimsy Jacob's ladders, those swaying rope ladders with thin wooden rungs dangling over the black, freezing Atlantic.
The psychological terror of that descent is unimaginable. You are an elderly woman or a parent holding a child. You are hanging onto a slick rope. Your hands are freezing, losing their grip.
And the ship is groaning behind you.
The massive black steel hull of the dying ship is popping and threatening to roll over at any second. And you are trying to time your drop into a tiny, bobbing lifeboat that is rising and falling sharply with the ocean swells in the dark.
The sheer terror of the environment broke the discipline of the crew. When survival instincts override training, order collapses.
What happened?
The historical inquiries note a shameful reality. Some of the very first lifeboats to launch from the starboard side were only half full, and they were filled almost entirely with terrified crew members.
You're kidding.
Cooks, stewards, waiters, mechanics. Men who had panicked rushed the boats and abandoned the very passengers they were legally and morally obligated to protect.
The desperation on the sloping deck led to horrific, preventable tragedies during the evacuation itself. We have the agonizing story of Tullio Di Sandro.
Yeah, this one is rough.
He is standing at the very edge of the tilted deck, clutching the railing with his wife and their 4-year-old daughter, Norma. The lifeboat is bobbing wildly in the dark waves below them, The crew in the boat are yelling to throw the child down.
They're trying to catch her.
In a moment of sheer, terrifying panic, desperate to get her off the sinking Leviathan, Tullio drops his little girl into the void.
But the timing is wrong. The boat drops with a wave just as he releases her. He misses the outstretched hands of the catchers.
Little Norma plummets and strikes her head violently on the heavy wooden thwarts of the lifeboat. She was eventually evacuated by a rescue ship to a hospital in Boston, but the trauma was too severe.
She died from a fractured cranium without ever waking up.
It is the agonizing, deeply unfair reality of human panic operating in an impossible situation.
Up on the bridge, Captain Calamai is paralyzed by the unfolding horror. He knows the grim math. He has over 1,600 souls on board, and because the portside boats are pinned, he only has enough lifeboat capacity for a few hundred.
So what does he do?
He actively delays sounding the official abandoned ship alarm on the ship's whistle because he is absolutely terrified of inciting a complete murderous stampede.
He knows that if 1,600 panicked people rush the remaining boats, they will crush each other.
Instead, he stands in the dark, broadcasting frantic, desperate SOS calls into the fog over the emergency radio. Need immediate assistance. Need lifeboats. Listing severely.
And the ocean initially seemed incredibly empty. The U.S. Coast Guard picked up the distress calls immediately, and because the collision occurred in a heavily trafficked shipping lane, help was technically relatively close.
But the vessels that responded first simply didn't possess the logistical capacity for mass casualty rescue.
The first ship to arrive at the coordinates is a small freighter called the Cape Ann. She answers the call, but she only has two 40-person lifeboats. It's a drop in the bucket.
Then the U.S. Navy transport Private William H. Thomas arrives, followed by the destroyer escort Edward H. Allen.
They're launching their small motor whaleboats, pulling exhausted people from the slick hull and dragging those who fell from the ropes out of the dark water.
But the math still wasn't working. Even with the heavily damaged Stockholm taking on hundreds of survivors using its own undamaged lifeboats, there were still hundreds of terrified passengers trapped on the dying Andrea Doria.
The Italian liner was groaning loudly, listing further and further toward capsizing. The water was reaching the upper deck.
A massive loss of life, hundreds drowning in the dark, seemed entirely inevitable.
But then steaming out of the dark comes a cinematic salvation that feels written for a Hollywood movie.
This truly is one of the most incredible, heroic moments in the history of maritime rescue. 44 miles away, steaming east toward Europe, is the absolute pride of the French line.
The Ile-de-France.
Yes. She is a massive, elegant, 44,500-ton luxury liner under the command of Captain Raoul de Beaudillon.
Now, de Beaudillon is resting in his cabin when his radio operator brings him the distress call. And at first he's highly skeptical. He looks at the message and thinks, there is no way a modern marvel, a double-hulled fortress like the Andrea Doria, is actually sinking.
He is a corporate captain. He has to worry about the massive financial costs to the French line if he turns his gigantic ship around.
Right, he burns tons of expensive fuel, delays his 940 wealthy passengers, only to arrive and find out it was a minor scrape and he isn't needed.
But de Beaudillon listens closely to the frantic radio chatter echoing across the frequency between the Doria, the Stockholm, and the Cape Ann.
He hears the panic.
He hears the desperation. He realizes the lifeboats are useless. The true scale of the horror dawns on him. Over 1,600 lives are hanging in the balance, and he commands the only vessel in the Atlantic large enough to save them all.
Wow. So he goes.
Without hesitation, he overrides the corporate concerns, orders the Ile-de-France to execute a hard turn, and drives his massive ship straight back into the fog at top speed toward the collision coordinates.
And what Captain de Beaudillon does when he arrives on the scene is a masterclass in psychological brilliance.
Less than 3 hours after the initial collision, the Ile-de-France approaches the disaster zone. Captain de Beaudillon is incredibly stressed. He is navigating a 44,000-ton behemoth blindly into a chaotic debris field filled with tiny lifeboats, people treading water, and two massive damaged ocean liners.
In heavy fog.
But just as he arrives at the coordinates, the heavy fog miraculously begins to thin and lift.
And de Beaudillon gives an order that fundamentally changes the entire psychological mood of the night. He turns to his officers and tells them to turn on every single exterior light on the massive ship.
The Ile-de-France blazed into the darkness like a floating, radiant city of light.
Imagine the emotional impact of that. You are shivering uncontrollably on the slanted, groaning deck of the Doria. You are covered in toxic oil. You've been separate from your family.
You think you're gonna die.
You are staring into the black void, absolutely convinced you are going to die in the freezing Atlantic within the hour. And suddenly, the fog parts, and this massive, brilliantly illuminated fortress appears out of the night, shining like a beacon of absolute safety.
Survivors later wrote that it was the most beautiful, overwhelming thing they had ever seen.
The psychological relief was instantaneous. The panic on the Doria finally subsided.
Debodian didn't just provide light. He provided a flawless tactical rescue. He expertly positioned his massive ship upwind to act as a giant windbreak, sheltering the Doria's vulnerable starboard side from the rolling ocean waves.
Smart.
And then the Ile-de-France went to work. She acted as the ultimate savior. She deployed all 10 of her massive motorized lifeboats, shuttling them back and forth between the dying Italian liner and her own secure hull.
The crew of the French liner were machines. They were pulling exhausted people out of the water, catching those dropping from ropes, hauling them over the gunnels.
And the human empathy on board the Ile-de-France was incredible.
The passengers on the French ship, these wealthy people on a luxury vacation, woke up, realized the tragedy was unfolding outside their windows, and immediately mobilized.
They stripped their own beds, they gave up their warm blankets, their dry robes, their coats, and their own cabins to these freezing, traumatized survivors who were being hauled aboard, coated in oil and blood.
It was an absolute triumph of maritime brotherhood. The Ile-de-France alone rescued 753 people from the brink of death.
The Stockholm, despite its crushed bow and its own casualties, took on 545.
The Cape Ann, the William H. Thomas, the Edward H. Allen. Together, against all physical odds and the failures of the ship's own safety systems, they saved 1,660 people.
It remains one of the greatest, most successful civilian maritime mass rescues in human history.
The human cargo was finally safe, but the majestic Andrea Doria, the pride of Italy, was now a hollow, dying leviathan left alone in the water to succumb to her fatal wounds.
The morning of July 26 broke clear and bright. The suffocating fog was completely gone, leaving the Doria totally exposed under the sun as she slowly, agonizingly died.
What happened to the captain?
Captain Calamai had remained on the bridge, paralyzed by grief. He had finally abandoned ship at 6 a.m., stepping into a rescue boat only after he was absolutely certain every living soul was off.
He wanted to go down with the ship, didn't he?
He had desperately wanted to stay on board, perhaps hoping a tugboat could tow her to the shallow waters of the Nantucket shoals, but his officers literally dragged him away. It was mathematically clear the ship was doomed.
The visual of her final hours is deeply unsettling. By 10 a.m., the list is so extreme that the starboard side dips fully underwater. Those 3 beautiful, terraced, outdoor swimming pools, they slowly refill, but this time with the actual churning ocean.
As the bow slides under, the massive stern rises high into the air, exposing the giant bronze port propeller to the sky.
As the port side finally slipped below the waves, the physics of buoyancy took over. The unused port lifeboats, the ones that had been pinned uselessly in the air all night, snapped free of their metal davits and floated to the surface.
Bobbing upside down in a neat row, looking exactly like a string of white gravestones marking the site.
At 10:09 a.m., exactly 10 hours after the violent impact, the Andrea Doria capsized completely, rolled over, and sank bow first into the dark abyss.
And hovering right above this in a small chartered airplane was Harry A. Trask, a photographer for the Boston Traveler.
He captured the ship's violent death throes in a series of incredibly famous, haunting photographs that actually won the Pulitzer Prize the following year.
You can look at the photos and literally see the water churning white and boiling as the air escapes, watching this giant black hull vanish forever.
But while the ship was dying, a quiet death in the ocean, a completely different kind of agony was unfolding on land in New York City.
The agony of the unknown. The families waiting at the pier.
Because the mass rescue had been so chaotic, and the survivors were scattered across 6 completely different ships heading to different ports, no one knew exactly who had lived and who had died in the crushed cabins.
The docks in New York were swarming with thousands of terrified families, Red Cross workers setting up triage centers, and an absolute media frenzy.
I want to circle back to Edward P. Morgan, the radio broadcaster we mentioned earlier. On the night of the sinking, he went on the ABC radio network and delivered this highly professional, deeply stirring report to the nation about the collision of these 2 titans in the fog.
But what he didn't tell his listeners.
Right. What he kept completely hidden behind his professional anchor voice was that he knew his ex-wife and his 14-year-old daughter, Linda, were booked in the exact cabin the Stockholm struck.
He was broadcasting the news of a tragedy to the world while believing in his heart that the event had just killed his own child.
The emotional weight of that is staggering. It wasn't until the following day, as the Stockholm slowly limped back into New York Harbor with her crushed, mangled bow, that Morgan found out Linda was the miracle girl who had been scooped onto the Swedish ship.
His radio broadcast the following night, delivered after learning she was alive against all odds, is widely considered one of the most raw, emotional moments in the history of broadcast journalism.
But not everyone standing on those docks got a miracle. We have Ruth Roman, a famous Hollywood actress of the era, swarmed by flashing cameras as she waits desperately on the pier, praying her 3-year-old son Richard is on one of the rescue ships.
They had been separated in the terrifying chaos of the tilted decks.
Thankfully, a few hours later, he was carried safely down the gangway of the Ile de France.
But for the DeSandro family, who had driven all night behind police escorts to reach that hospital in Boston, they only found little Norma lying unconscious. She never woke up.
And for the families of the 46 passengers who died instantly in the impact zone, they waited on the docks for days, watching every single exhausted face come down the gangways until the grim, permanent reality finally set in.
The bodies trapped deep inside the crushed steel of the impact zone were never recovered. They went down with the ship, entombed in the dark.
So the final toll is 51 dead in total, 46 passengers on the Doria, and 5 crew members working in the bow of the Stockholm. In the immediate aftermath, as the shock wore off, the public and the media demanded answers.
Who is to blame for this?
How did 2 ships equipped with radar run into each other on the open ocean? Wait, if 51 people died, there was no way the U.S. Coast Guard or the maritime lawyers just let this go. Someone had to be sued. How did neither company go bankrupt from this?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the corporate hubris transforms into a calculated legal cover-up. The legal mechanics of maritime law are designed to protect commerce, often at the expense of justice.
The hearing started in New York City. You have dozens of high-powered maritime lawyers. The officers from both ships are called to testify. The media is expecting a massive, drawn-out courtroom battle between the Swedish-American line and the Italian line,
to determine the exact percentage of fault.
But then it just abruptly stops. The whole thing is shut down.
The inquiry was derailed by the invocation of a highly controversial piece of maritime legislation, the Limitation of Liability Act of 1851.
Explain how that works, because it sounds like a get-out-of-jail-free card for billionaires.
It essentially is. The act was originally written in the 19th century to encourage the shipping trade. It states that if a ship is involved in a disaster, the shipowner's financial liability for damages and lawsuits is capped at the post-crash value of the vessel, plus any pending freight charges.
Wait, the post-crash value? The Andrea Doria was at the bottom of the ocean. Its value was literally $0.
Precisely. The Italian line filed a petition to limit their liability to exactly that. 0, plus some pocket change for the passenger fares.
That's disgusting.
Facing years of litigation with capped payouts, the victims' lawyers were cornered. Behind closed doors, the Swedish-American line and the Italian line reached a sudden, highly confidential out-of-court settlement.
The hearings were permanently shut down before the designers and engineers of the Andrea Doria could ever be called to the stand to testify under oath.
Both shipping lines contributed to a relatively modest victim settlement fund, absorbed their own massive hull damages, and walked away.
Why bury the truth so quickly? Or were they so terrified of the public finding out?
Both companies had massive existential financial incentives to ensure the structural and operational secrets of their ships never saw the light of a public courtroom.
Because of the flaws.
The Italian line was absolutely terrified of the engineers being forced to admit on the record that the Andrea Doria had a dangerously top-heavy design.
They didn't want to explain why the bulkhead stopped at A deck, turning the ship into an ice cube tray.
They didn't want to explain the missing watertight door in the generator tunnel, and most importantly, they could not afford to let the public know about the fatal operational failure of intentionally refusing to ballast the empty fuel tanks with seawater just to save a few dollars on cleaning costs.
Okay, I understand why the Italians wanted to hide. But why did the Swedish line agree to drop it? Their ship was essentially the victim of calamine turning left into them.
The Swedish line had a massive conflict of interest hiding in the background. They had a brand new, multi-million-dollar luxury liner, the Gripsholm, currently under construction.
Let me guess. Where was it being built?
At the Ansaldo shipyard in Genoa, Italy. The exact same shipyard owned by the exact same government entities that built the Andrea Doria.
Oh, wow.
The Swedish line couldn't afford to anger the Italians and jeopardize their new flagship. Furthermore, they desperately wanted to avoid the world dissecting the gross incompetence of their exhausted out. third officer, Karstens, entirely misreading his radar scale and actively steering his ice-breaking ship directly into an oncoming passenger liner.
It was a conspiracy of mutual corporate preservation. The only person who really took the fall for the 51 deaths was Captain Calamai.
He was quietly forced into permanent retirement by the Italian line to avoid any further bad publicity.
His daughter later gave interviews, saying he lived the rest of his life as a deeply broken man, carrying the heavy, silent sadness of someone who had lost a child. He never went to sea again. He was the scapegoat.
The human tragedy and the engineering failures were neatly swept under the rug of confidential corporate settlements. But the ocean has a long memory. The Andrea Doria wasn't done making headlines, and horrifyingly, she wasn't done claiming human lives.
No, she wasn't. Fast forward to the present day. The Andrea Doria sits 240 feet deep at the bottom of the North Atlantic. And in the elite, highly dangerous technical scuba diving community, she has earned a very specific, very chilling nickname.
She is known as the Mount Everest of scuba diving.
She is the ultimate deadly prize for wreck divers. But let's be clear about what diving the Andrea Doria actually entails. This isn't a sunny reef in the Bahamas.
Not at all.
At 240 feet deep, the water is pitch black. The sunlight doesn't penetrate. It's freezing cold, hovering just above freezing year-round. The wreck sits right in the path of violent, unpredictable ocean currents that can rip a diver's mask right off their face.
And worse, because the shoals are a highly popular commercial fishing area, the entire massive decaying hull is draped in a thick, invisible web of heavy commercial fishing nets and thin, razor-sharp monofilament fishing lines.
It is an active, lethal trap for humans. Those invisible monofilament lines easily snag on diving valves, tank manifolds, and breathing regulators.
If you get tangled in the dark at 240 feet, you cannot simply swim to the surface. Doing so would cause your blood to literally boil with nitrogen bubbles.
You mentioned these are elite divers. How do they even survive at that depth?
To survive the extreme pressure at 240 feet, which is over 8 atmospheres of pressure crushing your body, divers cannot breathe normal air. The nitrogen in standard air becomes highly narcotic at that depth, causing severe hallucinations.
Nitrogen narcosis.
Yes, the oxygen itself becomes highly toxic and will trigger fatal seizures. To survive, these divers must use mixed gas diving. They breathe a custom blend called trimix, replacing the nitrogen and some oxygen with helium.
And coming back up.
When they ascend, they must endure staged decompression, hanging on a rope in the freezing water for hours, slowly off-gassing the chemicals from their tissues before they can safely brook the surface.
And while they're down there, fighting the pressure, the cold, and the nets, the ship herself is structurally collapsing around them. After decades submerged in corrosive salt water, the steel is rapidly deteriorating.
The upper decks have flattened out and started to slide off the hull into a chaotic debris field. Divers who go down there consistently describe the Doria as a noisy wreck.
The acoustics of the decay are terrifying. The violent ocean currents actively tear the weakened metal apart. Divers report hearing the heavy steel groaning, shifting, and violently snapping in the dark while they are swimming through the pitch-black corridors.
It's like the ship is still alive and screaming in agony, and people continue to die trying to touch her. Since 1956, at least 22 elite, highly trained technical scuba divers have died exploring the Andrea Doria.
These aren't amateurs making mistakes. These are people who intimately understand the physics of mixed gas and decompression. Yet the wreck still claims them.
John Ormsby, a highly experienced diver, drowned in 1985 after getting hopelessly caught in the invisible wires. Robert Santulli, dead from massive oxygen toxicity convulsions in 1993. David Bright, a leading wreck explorer, dead from catastrophic decompression sickness in 2006.
The list of fatalities goes on and on.
There are incredible, harrowing stories, like those chronicled in Robert Kurson's fantastic book Shadow Divers, about the extreme psychological and physical toll this wreck takes on the men and women who dare to visit it. Guys like Peter Gimbel, who went down just a week after it sank to take photos for Life magazine.
Or the salvage teams that risked their lives to drag up the ship's bronze bell and the purser's safe.
They dive down there to recover delicate china plates, brass bells, or the decaying remnants of the surrealist art. But in doing so, they willingly enter a crumbling, haunted labyrinth that is actively trying to kill them.
It brings us to the end of an incredible, deeply unsettling historical narrative arc. The Andrea Doria was designed to be the absolute pinnacle of human luxury, art, and engineering. A floating masterpiece meant to symbolize a nation's resurrection and triumph over adversity.
but through a toxic, entirely avoidable mix of bad weather, corporate arrogance, fundamentally dangerous design flaws, and simple, tragic human error, it was transformed in an instant into a real-life horror story.
It yielded one of the most miraculous, perfectly executed rescues in history, thanks to the sheer bravery of the Ile-de-France. But it ultimately became a haunted, lethal underwater tomb, a decaying monument to the absolute limits of our control over the natural world.
It really makes you think.
Next time you're standing on a beach, looking out at the ocean, I want you to imagine the sheer terrifying scale and weight of that water. Think about how quickly our modern comforts, our advanced radar screens, our double-hulled fortresses, our heated swimming pools, can be swallowed whole and silenced by the dark, freezing waters of the Atlantic.
We constantly build these massive machines to conquer the environment, to bend the ocean to our schedules and our desire for luxury. But the environment always, inevitably, has the final say.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to ponder. The Andrea Doria was built to be a testament to human mastery over the sea. But as her collapsing steel hull continues to claim the lives of those elite divers who dare to visit her today, we have to ask, is the ocean slowly destroying the Andrea Doria, or is the Andrea Doria using the ocean to take revenge on the humanity that failed her? Keep that in mind the next time you look out over the dark, endless water. Until next time, keep diving deep.